In my last video, I expressed concerns over how Thor would be depicted in Love and Thunder. In it, I invoked the handling of Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi, and offered two alternative takes on how Luke could have been handled. Here is a recap of my suggestions. Luke could have been on that island hiding from Snoke, a being with powers beyond what Luke or anyone has seen before. If Snoke got a hold of Luke, the consequences could be dire. So Luke has been researching Snoke and fully intended to rejoin the fight once he knew what he was up against. Luke could have been aware of Starkillerbase and feared that his presence would be felt by Kylo Ren or Snoke, and they would know where the Resistance base is. Not only does Return of the Jedi provide precedence for this plotline, but I could make a separate video on how Luke could have gone in this direction without changing The Last Jedi all that much. In this video, I will apply these versions of Luke to The Last Jedi and see how differently that movie plays out. So my first scenario involves Luke weary of Snoke's power and capabilities and was hiding from Snoke until such a time Luke can determine ways in which he can gain the edge over Snoke. In my second scenario, Luke isn't as concerned about Snoke as he is about Starkillerbase. While brainstorming how The Last Jedi plays out in these two scenarios, I learned that the second scenario is not as interesting as the first, so I'm gonna get the boring scenario out of the way.
Must be the most boring woman on Earth.
When Rey hands Luke the lightsaber, Luke asks her how she came by it. Rey gives a brief outline of her adventures from The Force Awakens. The conversation can be slowed down by Luke when he hears about the death of Han and goes down to greet Chewie. At this point, we can go back to the conflict between the First Order and the Resistance. In my concession to Almighty Mouse, the only factor I am changing is the character of Luke and his motivations. So far, that factor only changes what happens on Ahch-to. So far, everything else plays out the same way. Back on Ahch-to, Luke urges Rey to explain her encounter with Kylo Ren and is astonished to hear what she has accomplished. Luke learns of the destruction of Starkillerbase. It is here that Luke decides to rejoin the fight, and he takes his X-Wing and has Rey fly ahead to where the Radius was. Luke then looks into the Force to see what was happening, and he consults with Obi-Wan over his next course of action. While Luke's instinct would be to attack the Supremacy, Obi-Wan advises him to rejoin the Resistance on board the Radius. Luke heeds Obi-Wan's advice, and his presence prevents Poe, Finn, and Rose from partaking on their Cantobite mission. After visiting Leia, who still ends up in a coma, he then meets with Holdo and determines that there is a plan. We can then get a few scenes of Luke training Rey and assessing her power, but they won't be as thorough or effective given the settings they were in. The Resistance escapes the crate, and the First Order misses them entirely. In other words, Last Jedi turns out to be a very boring movie, even more so than it already was. I know that in my Love and Thunder video, I suggested that this scenario won't change the movie much, but as I was writing this very script, I realized how wrong I was. The Snoke scenario is much more interesting and does a better job of not changing The Last Jedi all that much. In this scenario, the movie plays out similarly to how it does in my first scenario, branching off from when Luke learns about Starkillerbase. Instead, Luke warns her about the dangers posed by Supreme Leader Snoke, and explains that Snoke is the reason Luke is not prepared to get back in the fight.
That does it! SpongeBob is back in the fight!
He can explain potential consequences of what happens if Snoke managed to get a hold of him. Meanwhile, the sequence of Cantobite still plays out the same way, and if you want me to change Cantobite or find a way to remove it entirely, let me know and I'll address it in a future video. But so far, the change to Luke hasn't changed the First Order Resistance conflict in any meaningful way. Luke assesses what Rey is capable of, and she undergoes some more legitimate training. Here, we the audience can be shown that Luke is still superior due to his decades of experience. So much of this training is where Rey has to use the Force and contend with Luke's use of the Force to counter her objectives. Luke can explain the 7 forms of lightsaber combat, assess Rey's skills in each of them, and train her to use 1 or 2 of them. We then can be transported to Canterbury as Finn and Rose meet up with DJ and the trio make their escape. On Ahch-To, Rey inquires more about Snoke and why Luke is hiding from him. While the specifics of Snoke's backstory are beyond the scope of this video, at least we the audience get something. The two can have a brief brainstorm on Snoke's power and how to counter it and possibly come up with an idea. At that point, Rey could have that hand-holding scene with Kylo Ren and a fight with Luke. Then she could make the decision to go save Kylo Ren as she does in the original Last Jedi. The argument could evolve over how risky Snoke is and how accurate the Snoke theory is. Once Rey leaves, Luke could get a glimpse of the Supremacy bombarding the Resistance and lift his X-Wing out of the water, assuming it was even stuck there at all. After consulting with Yoda, Luke decides he has to do something about the Supremacy. During Rey's face-to-face with Snoke, as the Supremacy was targeting those escape pods, Luke could then begin using his X-Wing to attack the large cannons and unveiling a new force power to bypass any shields the Supremacy may have erected. At this point, Luke's change does impact the rest of the movie. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to assume Snoke doesn't become aware of Luke's actions and is killed off regardless. Rey and Kylo's battle with the Praetorian Guard play out similarly, only the choreographics are improved. Their subsequent falling out still plays out. Sadly, Finn and Rose are executed as Luke removes Holdo's need to perform that hyperspace ram. This also means that Kylo is not knocked out, meaning Rey has to now hide from him. He still has his lightsaber. Rey manages to sneak aboard Snoke's personal ship, as in the original. Luke, meanwhile, catches up with the Resistance where he meets up with Leia. By the time the final battle takes place, the Resistance has better equipment to ward off the First Order with. Does that base have fuel? For simplicity, I'm going to assume that it does, as then the Raddus, which is still available, is able to reveal and escape Kylo's grasp. Luke survives his encounter with Kylo Ren, and is available to fight during whatever events Episode 9 has to offer. So, those are my changes. Do you agree with my assessment? Do you have your own take on how Luke should have been handled in The Last Jedi? Should I do a video where I change a different aspect of the movie and see how it plays out? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below.